Hello and welcome. I'm Thomas Porteous and you are watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of the hour. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is willing to hold talks with US President Donald Trump, according to South Korean intelligence reports. The move could signal a new opening in US-North Korea diplomacy. Voters in New York are casting ballots in a high-stakes three-way mayoral contest. Democrat Zoran Mandani leads over independent Andrew Cuomo as Republican Curtis Sliwa campaigning on free childcare, rent freezes and transit reforms. Russia says its troops have pushed into Pavlovsk, a key transport hub in eastern Ukraine, after heavy fighting near the railway station. Kiev insists its forces are still holding the front lines despite Russian gains. UK far-right activist Tommy Robinson has been found not guilty of refusing to give his phone PIN to counter-terror police. The 42-year-old, who led a large far-right march earlier this year, thanked Elon Musk for covering his legal fees. Nigeria's government says its constitution does not permit religious persecution, responding to US President Donald Trump's threat of military action over attacks on Christians. Foreign Minister Youssef Tugar said actions are impossible under Nigerian law. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres voices deep concern over continued violations of the Gaza ceasefire. Speaking in Doha, he urged all sides to respect the first phase of the peace agreement and halt fighting immediately. US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says Washington will seek flexibility for its troops in South Korea to counter regional threats while maintaining focus on deterrence against North Korea. He spoke during a visit that included a DMZ tour. Now, Typhoon Kalamagi slams into the central Philippines, killing at least 2 people and forcing tens of thousands to evacuate. Torrential rains, powerful winds and storms are surging and lashing coastal communities as rescue operations intensify. Now we start this hour in Europe, and Ukrainian police have evacuated 9 civilians from the embattled city of the Konstantinivka in the Donetsk region, as Russian forces intensify their assault on the eastern front line. Officers from the White Angel evacuation unit have moved through streets lined with destroyed vehicles and buildings to reach trapped residents. Many of those rescued were elderly, unwilling or unable to leave despite continuous shelling. Police have also said that they discovered the body of a woman killed in a recent strike. Her son, who assisted in retrieving the body, described how 2 direct hits struck the building while he was next door. Let's take a listen in to what residents of the area had to say about the incident.
Никакого звука. Бах, и все. А я на лавочке сидела. Ногу сильно ударил, я не знаю, какие вообще. И крыша, и все.
Now, Hyundai Yudin, a 48-year-old officer with the White Angel unit, has said it has become impossible to enter Pavlovsk, another city under heavy fire. He explained that evacuees are being asked to walk to nearby villages where rescue teams can safely collect them, as vehicles have become prime targets for Russian forces. In Konstantinivka, officers have helped residents pack belongings, assisted the elderly and reassured others reluctant to abandon pets. Now we're joined by Alison Mutler. She's the former Associated Press bureau chief in Romania, and she joins us live from the Romanian capital. Alison, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Of course, what's leading the headlines right now in this conflict is, of course, this huge battle for that logistics hub in Pavlovsk, but that, of course, can't distract us from the fact that fighting on the ground is very much intensifying in other areas as well. Of course, Ukrainian police during this are evacuating civilians from these cities that are under siege. What does this tell us about the intensity of the fighting and the humanitarian situation on the ground?
Russia is concentrating its attacks on this area. It's very important. It's Donetsk, which is the area they're trying to seize control of. But this Provozk is actually where there's an important Ukrainian logistics center. So if that were to fall, that would seriously damage Ukraine's war effort, which is why there's so much pressure being piled on by Moscow, particularly on Provozk, but also on the other villages that you mentioned where they're trying to evacuate. So there's a lot of Russian pressure. They're concentrating their attacks there, and Ukraine is doing its best to defend it because they know if this Provozk falls, then that will seriously harm their war effort and give Russia a sort of easier ride into the areas it wants to seize.
Now, of course, Alison, as the saying goes, the first casualty of war is truth. With both sides releasing conflicting statements on how this battle for Pokrovsk is going. How does one go about navigating the information coming out of the region?
Well, I think, again, we have to thank very brave war reporters, particularly from international news agencies. I saw this morning Reuters particularly has sent a team in there, and they've been filming that. And I think it's obviously if we have foreign news reporters on the ground, and we do in this case, then those are the sources we should be relying on. Of course, they will also take statements from the government, but if you get both sides, then there's some kind of picture. But again, it's the brave war reporters from the international news agency and international media that are there on the ground. I think they are the sources that we can trust most, and they do it at great risk. There have been deaths of many journalists since the conflict began in 2022. But for me, when I see that it's an international news agency they're reporting, that gives me credibility. That gives me I know what they're talking about, and I can trust these sources.
Yes, and of course, both Pokrovsk and Kupiansk both reporting very, very heavy fighting currently. Let's focus on Pokrovsk first. What would that mean for the broader spectrum of the war? What would this mean for the war if Ukraine was to lose this crucial logistics hub, as you've mentioned, in the east?
Yes, it that's obviously what Russia is trying to do. They're trying to pressure Ukraine into submission. They're trying to get Ukraine to surrender this area. If they do manage to seize this logistics center, this will very much, as I said earlier, harm Ukraine's war effort in defending, particularly Donetsk, which is the area where Russia is putting the most pressure on. So it would be very bad news for Ukraine indeed. It's just coming out in these last few days because obviously in Ukraine there's news from different places every day. But this is where the crucial battle is going on at the moment, and this is where Russia is putting on all the pressure. They're trying to get basically Ukraine to crack, Ukraine to give in, and basically Ukraine to lose so they can seize the territory they want.
Yes, indeed. Alison, do stay with us. We have diplomatic updates, but we would, of course, bring you all the updates coming out of that developing situation on Ukraine's eastern front as we get them. Now, moving on. Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered his cabinet to take measures to develop transport and logistics links at Russia's border with China and with North Korea. The order requires the cabinet to draw up plans by December 1st for enhancing the infrastructure. This move is part of Russia's broader strategy to strengthen economic ties with its eastern neighbours in response to Western sanctions imposed over the war in Ukraine. This directive complements other recent initiatives aimed at boosting trade and cooperation in the region, including plans for increased grain exports to China and the potential integration of North Korea into Siberian and Far East logistics. This decision is significant as the war in Ukraine has pushed Russia back from Western markets and it now looks for new ties in the East. China has been Russia's biggest economic backer, and North Korea has not only supplied Russia with weapons, but also sent troops on the ground to help Russia fight in Ukraine. Alison joins us once again. Alison, of course, the relationship between Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un was on full display in Beijing at that military parade, all three of them walking together. What more can you tell us about the trade diversification it might that might happen due to this relationship, and of course North Korea's involvement here?
Well, as you said in your report, Vladimir Putin has had a whole raft of sanctions slapped on him by the European Union and now by the United States. So Russia is a vast country with many, many neighbors. So obviously it's looking to develop diplomatic, political and trade ties with other big partners. Now, as basically Putin cannot look towards the democratic West, it's looking towards the undemocratic East. And China and North Korea are natural partners, both politically and also economically for China. They're on the Chinese borders. The area is not very developed, and that is one thing in terms of transport links. And that's one thing that Vladimir Putin is trying to do, is to develop transport links, so he does have alternative routes for trade. But also those are areas where there are these precious metals which are needed for smartphones, electric vehicles, and for weapons. So that's very important for Vladimir Putin, and also for him to develop these trade ties, because he cannot do the trade he used to do with the raw materials, with the oil that he used to do with Europe and the US as well. So this is what this move is. Okay, you guys won't do business with me. I have alternative partners here in the East, and that's what he's doing. He's trying to shore up those partners and strengthen those ties, and create systems that work for him as the war effort continues. But also the Russian economy has been hit very badly by this war, so he does need to do this and to think towards the future, because these rare minerals, which perhaps 30 years ago were not so important, now that we do have electric vehicles, smartphones are part of everybody's everyday life, and we have a war raging, these rare minerals are very important. So that's what he's looking to do now.
Yes, and finally, Alison, of course, Beijing maintains that it remains neutral in this war. However, the position towards Moscow here in trade contradicts that in a way. Of course, Donald Trump has pushed for China to stop buying Russian oil. And even after that meeting, Xi Jinping said and told Donald Trump that he was possibly going to help him get that peace deal. Your thoughts on the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, and how, if Beijing is supporting Russia in its war machine?
I think China is playing a longer and more clever game than Russia. Russia is very much the junior partner in the Moscow-Beijing alliance. Very much so the junior partner. Russia needs China much more than the other way around. But Russia, because it wants to be the #1 player in the world, needs to play various partners. So it suits it also to have a good relationship with the United States and trade with the United States. Russia is the one that is at a disadvantage here. It's playing all its cards that it can. I mean, obviously the political systems in Russia and China are more similar, and geographically the countries are closer. But China is far too intelligent, far too strategic just to put its eggs in one basket. And as I said, Putin, Russia is very much the junior partner in this bromance, if you like, in this relationship between Xi and Putin. And Putin knows that, but Russia wants to elevate itself to being a major world player. So that is why it is forging a relationship with China, which is potentially the world's next superpower.
Yes, Alison Mutler, thank you very much. It's always an absolute pleasure to talk to you on these matters, and thank you very much for taking the time. We now move on for our next story. And at the World Summit for Social Development in Doha, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has urged an immediate halt to the fighting in Sudan, calling it a nightmare of violence. He appealed to both the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to stop the flow of weapons and come to the negotiating table under the guidance of his envoy. Guterres also voiced deep concern over the violations of the ceasefire in Gaza, which ended 2 devastating years of conflict, urging all parties to uphold the peace agreement, which both sides claim violations. The UN chief's remarks come as Sudan's humanitarian crisis worsens. Let's take a listen in to what Antonio Guterres had to say.
I call for an end to the flow of weapons and fighters into Sudan, which is making a desperate situation even worse. And finally, we need an immediate cessation of hostilities. I call both on the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces to work with my personal envoy for Sudan, Ramtan Lamamra, towards a negotiated settlement. Come to a negotiating table, bring an end to this nightmare of violence now. It's time for peace. I'm also deeply concerned about the continued violations of the ceasefire in Gaza. They must stop, and all parties must abide by the decisions of the first phase of the peace agreement.
We're now joined by Professor Rohan Gunaratne. He's an international affairs expert and he joins us live from Singapore. Professor Gunaratne, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Of course, the Gaza ceasefire is in effect. However, both sides claim multiple violations. We've seen Israeli strikes occur since October the 10th when that ceasefire came into effect. Of course, you've also got Sudan, which has seen over 100,000 people be killed. Now, for this discussion, Professor Gunaratne, I want to take us back to New York and when Donald Trump spoke in front of that podium, when he said, what is the point in the United Nations? He seemed to think that multilateralism is dead and that the United Nations can only write a strongly worded letter in order to solve these conflicts. Does this illustrate that? What can the United Nations actually do here, even as these conflicts rage on?
Thomas, United Nations is doing a lot, but it can do much more. There should be a greater capability of UN peacekeepers. There should be people who are sent as envoys to resolve these disputes before they break out into violence. And there should be much more investment the UN should make in countries, in governments, to create peacemakers, negotiators, mediators. Right now, government focus is to build national security, law enforcement, military and intelligence practitioners. So UN should invest more in helping governments to look at the option of peace negotiation and mediation of these conflicts. Because as you know, there are more conflicts today than ever before, and some of these conflicts kill a large number of people. You refer to the conflict in Sudan. Every day 1,000 people are being killed. In Gaza, we have seen that since October 10th, 250 Palestinians and Israelis has been killed. So what is important is in parallel with building the security and intelligence and law enforcement military capabilities, there should be also investment to resolve these conflicts before they manifest on the ground. And also when they manifest on the ground, mediators who are skilled enough to end them.
Yeah, and Professor Gunaratne, of course, you speak there of peacekeepers. Of course, the Israel-Gaza conflict is an incredibly complicated situation that of course, needed the United States' backing in order to broker. However, Sudan, what are the capabilities with United Nations peacekeepers when it comes to such conflicts like Sudan, like these African nations? What are the powers that they currently have when it comes to the United Nations, and do they have any power anymore?
UN can play a very limited role in Sudan. It is a Muslim on Muslim conflict because over 90% of the Sudan population is Muslims. The fight is between RSF, a breakaway faction of the Sudanese military, now expanding its remit. and of course committing very brutal atrocities. As the UN Secretary General said, there's flow of arms, flow of fighters, but certainly there can be Muslim leaders who in Africa and in the Middle East who can influence the outcome of that conflict. UN can play a very limited role in Sudan, but UN can play a more enhanced role in resolving other conflicts. It is true that because the UN forces on the ground are not so not robust enough, and the UN itself is quite reserved when it comes to peace enforcement. That is why we have seen the US and various governments deploying their forces. So what is important is for the UN to build greater capabilities in the coming months and the coming years.
Okay, Professor Gunaratne, do stay with us, but we have some big breaking news coming at our viewers right now. Former US Vice President Dick Cheney has died at the age of 84. He's died due to complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease. Cheney was the oldest living former US Vice President after the death of Walter Mondale in 2021. The news of his death has been confirmed by his family, and the statement issued by the family has stated that his wife, 2 daughters and other family members were present with him as he passed away. Cheney was the 46th Vice President who served alongside Republican President George W. Bush for 2 terms between 2001 and 2009. Was for decades a towering and polarizing Washington power player. In his final years, however, Cheney, still a hardline conservative, nevertheless became largely ostracized from his party over his intense criticism of Donald Trump, who he branded as a coward and the greatest ever threat to the republic. Of course, there's some huge news coming out of the United States. Former Vice President Dick Cheney has indeed died. We will bring you more on that later. We now move on over to the Indo-Pacific, where South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has met US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in Seoul. Hegseth is traveling to the country as part of a larger Asia tour. The US Defense Secretary's visit to South Korea is significant as it reaffirms US-South Korea military alliances. During the visit, he discussed key strategic adjustments, including South Korea's increased defense spending and the potential for a more flexible role for US troops to counter broader regional threats. Earlier, Hegseth visited the demilitarized zone on the border with North Korea, accompanied by his South Korean counterpart. When asked whether the US troops stationed in South Korea might be used in any conflicts beyond the peninsula, Hegseth responded that protecting against nuclear-armed North Korea remains the primary goal of US forces. However, US officials have signaled plans to make American forces more flexible to potentially operate outside the Korean peninsula in response to a broader range of threats, including one to Taiwan, of course. We're once again joined by Professor Gunaratne. Of course, the United States has many interests in the Indo-Pacific. Number one, of course, being the influence of Beijing. Your thoughts on the US Defense Secretary's, the Secretary of War, however you would like to call him's, attendance in South Korea during this time period, as tensions, of course, are very much rising in the region?
Thomas, it's a very timely visit because President Trump is very keen to reopen negotiations with North Korea. As you know, when he met with the North Korean leader in Singapore, he had built a very good rapport, and very recently, President Trump made a remark that he would very much like to re-engage North Korea. So I believe that the United States is keen to demonstrate strength by its Secretary of War visiting South Korea and also engaging Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, to ensure that the American strength is visible, American unity is visible. But at the same time, the type of conflict America faces with China and North Korea is one of negotiation rather than going to war. So I believe that the Americans have developed the right approach of wanting to have a series of meetings with North Korea, and this is likely to take place in the coming months, if not in the coming years.
Yes, Professor Rohan Gunaratne, thank you very much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you here on NewsX World. We now move over to Europe, and a stabbing incident on the Greek island of Evia has left one man dead and 2 others injured in what police believe may be linked to football-related violence. Authorities say a 20-year-old man was fatally stabbed while 2 others were wounded in separate attacks. According to a police spokeswoman, 5 people have been arrested, including 2 injured men, and at least 8 individuals were involved in total. The suspects are believed to be fans of rival soccer teams. Greece has long struggled with football hooliganism, prompting government crackdowns following multiple deaths in recent years. Officials note that some violent fan activity has expanded beyond stadiums with ties to criminal gangs. Authorities continue to investigate the exact motives behind the Evia attacks. Now we move on, and at least 26 people have been killed after Typhoon Kalamagi batters the central Philippines, triggering widespread flooding and devastation. The country's civil defense office confirms that most victims were drowned, with 21 fatalities reported in the Cebu province, where several towns remain underwater. Rescue teams continue to wade through submerged areas as thousands are displaced and power lines remain down. Meanwhile, a Philippine military helicopter assisting in relief operations has crashed in northern Mindanao. The Super Huey aircraft was en route to Bhutan City when it went down amid the stormy weather. And in the eastern Mindanao Command says the helicopter was supporting relief efforts for the typhoon, and that search and recovery operations are now underway. Authorities warn that more heavy rain could hit already inundated regions, raising the threat of further landslides and flooding. The government urges residents in vulnerable areas to remain on alert as rescue missions continue. Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World to get more international news updates.